Good morning. Hi, my name is Matthew Prince. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Cloudflare. We didn't really know what to expect when we did this. I certainly didn't expect that we were going to be having to scramble to find more chairs. So thank you all for being here. Cloudflare, if you don't know, is a company whose mission is to help build a better internet. We run one of the largest networks in the world, and we see about 10% of all internet requests flow through that network every single day. That's about the end of us talking about Cloudflare, though, today. Today isn't about us talking about ourselves. It's us talking to and talking with the people that are out making the internet what it is today. And so we've been doing the Cloudflare Internet Summit at our headquarters in San Francisco now for 3 years. And we realized that a huge portion of our company and a huge portion of the world doesn't necessarily come to San Francisco to hear about how the internet works. And so we thought it was high time for us to bring the summit and some of the great speakers that we have to Europe and to London. And so thank you so much for being here with us today. You're going to hear from a lot of people on stage, and our criteria for who we invite to come on stage and talk with us is the people who are working either as technologists, public policy makers, politicians, thinking about what the internet is going to be and what its future is. And we try and invite people that you might not have heard from before, not the people on the usual conference circuit, but people who are talking about, people who either inspire us or we think are doing something interesting, or sometimes are doing something really controversial, and we have a conversation. The other piece, though, and I encourage you to think about not just the people who are on stage, but the people who you're sitting next to in the audience. We have great investors here today, great startup founders and CEOs, technologists that are actually building some of the technology behind the scenes, journalists that are covering this, civil society organizations that are thinking about how we should be framing the policy of what the internet is. And they're sitting next to you. And so today, we started with a breakfast. We'll be breaking several times during the day, a lunch. We'll have cocktails afterwards. And I hope that as many of you not only can stick around and listen to the great speakers we have on stage, but get to know each other. Because together, we're all helping build a better internet. And it's not going to be one organization or one individual that sets that, but it's all of us collectively that are working toward that great goal. So thank you so much for being here. It's my huge pleasure and honor to welcome our first speaker. Sir David Omand is a visiting professor at the Department of War Studies at King's College in London. He was head of GCHQ from starting in 1996, and was the permanent secretary to the Home Office. He's just published a book, which you can pre-order, on the idea of principled spying, which some of you might think of as an oxymoron, but we're going to talk to him about what that is. And so it's my great honor to invite Sir David to the stage. Thank you. So first of all, there you go. That's exactly right. Book. It's available for pre-order, I understand.
Yep, and I will give you the code, which, all caps, AAFLYG6. So go to the Oxford University Press website, put in the code, and you'll get 30% off.
You've paid for people's registration like that. We'll repeat the code at the very end as well, in case people missed it. So principled spying. I'd imagine there are some people in the audience that think that that term is an oxymoron. What do you mean by it, and what does it mean to be a principled spy?
Well, first thing to say is that an audience like you should be interested in this subject. When you think of the controversies about bulk access to digital data, under what circumstances might that slide into mass surveillance, issues around anonymity on the net, issues around crypto wars. These are, at heart, ethical issues. They're about what ought to be. And for those working on the further frontiers of artificial intelligence, the ethical issues are enormous. So I hope that by looking at the intelligence part, it's going to help people work their way through some of these issues. You're absolutely right. There is an inherent tension because what do we mean by intelligence? I mean reducing ignorance so that decision makers make better decisions. Secret intelligence achieves that purpose in respect of information that other people don't want you to have.
So what are some of the principles, if you're an intelligence agency, that you think organizations like GCHQ should be guiding?
I mean, in a liberal democracy, you need a code of conduct. We have it for university teachers. We're not supposed to, and don't, seduce our students. You have it for solicitors. You're not supposed to embezzle the client's money. I don't know what the professional code for coders is working on AI, but you need it. And in a liberal democracy, we license people on our behalf to steal secrets, which sounds a fairly unethical kind of activity, because it's going to mean intruding on people's privacy or persuading people to abandon commitments they made to their government, for example, if they're going to help you. So behavior that in everyday life we would not want to live by has to be the code. So how do you reconcile this? Now, there's a very clear precedent, which is the armed forces. Death and destruction, weapons in their hands, yet we have tamed some of the worst excesses of warfare. And the answer is a series of principles, and this is what we go through in the book. So, proportionality, the degree of intrusion that an agency should have into your privacy has to be in a relationship to the harm they are trying to prevent, so you don't misuse those sort of techniques. It gets very interesting when you get into digital bulk access, because by definition, bulk access, the huge majority of the material, say on a cable, is of no conceivable intelligence interest. Yet, with the packet switch networks, we all know you have to collect in bulk in order to interrogate the material. So the key ethical distinction is how good is the algorithm at discriminating between the information in which there is a legitimate national security or public safety interest and the material where clearly there isn't.
You know, there's an old saying in the UK that gentlemen don't read each other's mail. And yet that's exactly what a spying organization is having to do. And you know, that was, the saying came from literally envelopes, and now it's,
well, it was
email.
US Secretary of State Stimson who first said that and closed down the United States cryptographic effort. So the United States entered the Second World War not in the situation in which it should have done. The United Kingdom entered the Second World War, as we know, with Bletchley Park gearing up with some extraordinary minds like Turing put to work on it. So it's in the nature of the kind of threats that we face. Terrorism, you know, just list them: dictators, terrorists, criminal groups, serious hacker groups, paedophile rings. You go on and on. The characteristic they all have in common is they all use the same technology. They are using the internet as a way of communication, and they are leaving a digital trail of where they've been, where they're going, their identities, and so on. If you want the rule of law, and I passionately do believe in the rule of law, then you have to have some way of bringing those sort of people to justice.
What do you mean when you say the rule of law from the intelligence agency side? What exactly does that mean? Because typically the rule of law requires some level of transparency, and yet you inherently, when you're engaged in secret intelligence, it's hard to be transparent.
Yeah. I can remember a conversation with the head of a foreign intelligence agency of a country I won't mention, who said to me some time ago, "I can't understand you British. Why do you even bother talking about this kind of issue? The point of having an intelligence agency is it doesn't have to follow the law or indeed any ethical code. If it was as easy as that, well, the police and the armed forces could do it all. The reason for an intelligence agency is to do unlawful things." That is not, and hasn't been for the last 100 years, the approach the British state has taken. And what one has, sorry, there you go, forgot to switch it off.
That's okay. If it's important, you know, if it's national security, then yeah. I think we can pause.
Yeah, this is where I could actually pull your legs, couldn't I?
You wouldn't do that.
I wouldn't do that. But the point is that if you can have a framework of domestic regulation, which actually gives confidence to the public that if you give these powerful tools, particularly the digital intelligence tools, to your agencies, they're not going to be misused. Now, this has required over the last couple of years a huge rethink in the UK about the boundary of secrecy. So we now have on the British statute book, anyone can read it, it's open, the Investigatory Powers Act, with the government admitting, for example, that it undertakes hacking, equipment interference. It does allow agencies, under careful regulation, to hold bulk databases and to mine those data. Now, a couple of years ago, governments would have said we can neither confirm nor deny that any such activity goes on. That's changed. And the reason it's changed is the need for public confidence that as we are in this digital world where so much personal information about all of us is available, that it's necessary to allow access to that information to keep us safe. But you really do need much tougher controls. And that's what we've now got: judicial oversight, parliamentary oversight, regulation, and so on.
So I think that the point of trust is a really, and we have, you know, in the post-Snowden era, there is a different level of trust that is out with these agencies. How can, if in the past it was we won't comment on this, and now sort of that what the agencies are doing has been, at least at some level, spelled out. How as a citizen can you feel comfortable that that really is now defining the boundaries of where intelligence agencies are going?
I mean, it's always going to be frustrating, and it's always going to be frustrating for investigative journalists. Yeah. Because the boundary of secrecy has been redrawn. So the fact that it is possible to put malware on a terrorist's computer is not a secret. There are probably people in the audience who are perfectly well capable of coding up such an application. That's not the secret. What is the secret is which techniques are being applied to try and track which dangerous people. Because if they get to know that, they can dodge. They can easily dodge. So you still need essential secrecy about sources and methods. But it's about which sources they're trying to use to uncover which threats. When it comes to public confidence, you can't have the general public, or indeed all of Parliament, marching into GCHQ to look at the books. So you have to have trust by proxy. So there has to be a group of people who do have complete access and can go in. That's what they now have. They didn't have before, but that's what they now have, both for the parliamentarians and perhaps more importantly for the senior former appeal court judge and the large team of experts which he is now assembling, who will be able to check and report to Parliament, yup, it's all going according to the regulation, or perhaps things are being done, I am going to reveal them in public, Parliament needs to consider updating the law, for example.
How universal do you think these principles are? I mean, I think that in a liberal democracy like the UK, you might be able to get a sense of this. How global do you think these policies are? Or maybe another way of asking it is, do you worry at all that as countries that do have a good sense of a rule of law announce we are putting malware on target devices, we are doing this, that actually emboldens maybe those countries that don't have as much of a sense of a rule of law?
You have to start at a national level by saying, do we have, as a democracy, a democratic consensus in this area on what should be allowed? I mean, we've now had a big debate in Parliament, we've got a law, there is that consensus. You can sense across Europe there is beginning to be a common approach. It's not there yet, and some countries are still very secretive about this kind of activity. But that is spreading. But of course, there are many countries who will never adopt this approach. Does that handicap the UK? I think our own agencies would say no, they would prefer to work under the rule of law with the confidence that gives that the public will support what they're doing. One of the ironies of Edward Snowden's activities is that the amount of digital intelligence, intelligence gathering, has gone up as a result of his revelations, because every country in the world said, wow, if the Americans can do that, we want to do it too. So this is kind of unintended consequence of his whistleblowing.
And is that so? What are the international norms that we need to have to make sure that that isn't effectively an intelligence arms race, where everyone is just saying, "Well, if the British can do that, if the Americans can do that, we're going to push that further," which then, as the British and Americans see what the Chinese are now doing, that just continues that cycle.
We are a long way from having international norms on espionage. There is no international law on espionage. I doubt whether there ever will be, because countries will never agree on the boundary of what espionage is. What would be regarded as legitimate academic investigation in one country would be regarded as certainly dangerous espionage in another. So when we don't have a framework of international law to regulate it. Does that mean there are no norms? No. You can already begin to see, for example, international humanitarian law should apply in cyberspace as it does in the traditional 3 dimensions. If it's unlawful for an air force to bomb a hospital, it should be unlawful for a country to knock a hospital out using malware. That's just a simple example. The approach to crypto has changed since my days in the business a long time ago. Now the priority is very clearly the security of the internet as a future vehicle for economic and social development. That's the priority, not intelligence gathering. Does that mean that some 0-day will never be squirreled away in case it ever needs to be? No, it doesn't mean that. But it does mean that the care with which that equities balance has to be achieved is going to have to be much more careful, and is more carefully judged than perhaps would have been necessary in the early days.
So we're a private company. We do a bunch to secure the internet with cryptography and other things. We make intelligence agencies' lives a little bit more difficult. What do you think of as the responsibility of technology companies that are developing technologies in terms of where should they be in the sort of cooperation with law enforcement? Apple just yesterday announced that they're making it again more difficult to get information off of phones. How should tech companies be thinking about that interchange?
Well, my own view is that tech companies should not be thinking of this in their own little bubble. they should actually be engaging in a multi-stakeholder discussion and talking to government very actively about what is sensible. I mean, in other areas such as the environment, companies tend to put out advertisements, say, corporate social responsibility, we help look after the environment, and so on. What is the corporate social responsibility in respect to these companies' responsibility for ensuring we live under the rule of law? Mm-hmm. We don't allow in the 3 dimensions of ordinary life there to be areas where law enforcement cannot, with a warrant, seek evidence, for example, from your bank account. If a company designs products which are deliberately designed so that it is not possible for law enforcement, then this creates a real tension with the underlying principle of the rule of law. Now, if you take the San Bernardino shooter case, the famous Apple case, I had a lot of sympathy with Apple, because if it had been true that the only way to get into that iPhone was to build a parallel operating system without any security, that would have been quite a dangerous thing to construct. Could it get loose into the wild, in which case the security of every user of that mark of phone would. But on the other hand, if law enforcement has one phone, they have a proper warrant from a court saying that phone potentially contains evidence of some very serious crime, in that case terrorism. Can technology not provide a solution which allows for the opening of that phone, but not the whole class of phones? And the answer is very obviously, and some of the people in this audience may have worked on it, is yes, it's very easy to work out a system whereby you have split key, and part of the key is embodied in the hardware in the phone, part is held by the company. With a warrant, you can reunite. That would get you into that phone, but no other phone, because of the uniqueness of the key. I mean, it's not impossible to devise these. So that's the kind of development that I think the companies and government and civil society really need to debate. It's not going to happen tomorrow.
So without going into the technical details of whether you can build backdoors in a secure way to the phones, let's just posit that that's possible. How, though, if there aren't international standards around when surveillance is appropriate, and there aren't necessarily rule of law standards that are global, how is a company, when you're holding the access to that back door, how do you say yes to certain requests in certain places and yet say no to other requests in other parts of the world where you are participating in that market, and you get requests that again, I think us sitting here on stage might say, of course, that shouldn't have been turned over.
Well, the requests have to be lawful. And your point, is that so very different from international extradition, where a country with slightly dubious standards might demand the extradition of some suspect from the UK or the US, and you have a process, and you have some countries where it is accepted that if you get a lawful request from a court in that country, the extradition will probably go through, and we have such arrangements across Europe now, the common arrest warrant. But if you have a request from a country that doesn't necessarily satisfy that, then probably the Department of Justice in the US is going to stop it and say, no, that's not a legitimate warrant. So the responsibility can't just rest with the company making up its own mind. You need some legal process behind this.
It's it though does create a real tricky situation. I'm reminded of when Jerry Yang, who was the CEO of Yahoo, got a lawful request from the Chinese government to turn over data that was housed in China, and they made the determination that they had to comply with that request. and they turned that data over. And then he was hauled before the US Congress, and a congressman said, sir, you may be a technical giant, but you are a moral pygmy. And as in an increasingly global world, when we don't have those norms, I'm curious how you would think through that same situation.
Well, this comes back to the rule of law. You're not going to have international agreements, legal agreements with everyone, which is going to solve your problem, not at least in the foreseeable future. You can work that through, say, with the democracies across Europe, for example, and North America. And you can produce a framework which allows those issues to be properly, legally considered. So it's not impossible to make a start, but some of these problems are going to take a very long time to resolve.
So take me back to when you were the head of GCHQ. It's 1996. The internet is just emerging. How did you view that new emergence at the time? Was it on your radar screen? Did you see it as a threat? Did you see it as an opportunity? What was, back in the early days of the internet, how did the intelligence community envision what this would become?
When I arrived at the end of the Cold War, the intelligence community was facing two huge challenges. One was about the fact that the main adversary had disappeared. The wall was down. The machine that had been built to monitor the activities of, for example, the group of Soviet forces in Germany, no longer needed. Reorientation, new target sets, including terrorism, proliferation, support to law enforcement. So that was one set of challenges, which in cultural terms were enormous for the organization. The other set of challenges were about the tsunami of digitization. And you could see that coming. I mean, 96, Hotmail existed, but email was something reserved to people in corporations, or people who could afford the rather expensive home computers that were then available. But you could see what was going to happen. You could see the way that even with the compression algorithms were developing, which were going to allow volumes suddenly to go up enormously, quite apart from the fiber developments. And the digital intelligence meant, because of the packet switch networks, not only the development of a lot of new application of a lot of new technology, but the re-engineering of the thought processes about how you access, rather than just collect in a linear process, collecting intelligence on, shall we say, the Polish Air Force when it was part of the Warsaw Pact, passing it to an analyst writing up reports, passing it to the Air Force. Long, rather slow process. Suddenly, you're in a world in which your targets are the people, the individuals. You're trying to track their digital traces. The analyst becomes almost like a police investigator, directing where do I look next for information to help me solve this problem, who was responsible for this terrorist attack or whatever. And coming back to your earlier question, after one of these awful attacks takes place, the security and intelligence communities then have a starting point. They have a seed. They know that on a particular day, possibly a suicide bomber, so you know the identity of the individual, there may be a mobile phone. There's a place where the attack took place. So you can then begin, if you have retained the data, to construct intelligent questioning of that data. or if the companies retained the data, who looked at Google Street View of the site of the terrorist attack in the fortnight beforehand? Did anyone try reconnaissance? Is that a question the company should answer? Well, the answer is the companies have indeed been helping across Europe where these sort of attacks have been taking place. I regard that as perfectly legitimate, but it takes us into a whole new ethical dimension about retention of data, not just interrogation of data, and for how long.
Yeah, I'm gonna let the audience ask a couple of questions. We probably have for a few.
Yeah.
So if you have a question, raise your hand. But I did want to before we take questions from the audience, there's a story that you tell about a fresco in Siena and illustrating the difference between what is good government and bad government, and whether that's changed in all the time since it's 14th century. Can you talk about that? And then if you have a question, raise your hand and someone will come to you with a microphone.
Yeah, I thoroughly recommend a visit to the town hall in Siena, in the beautiful square, the Palazzo Pubblico. The 14th century frescoes by Lorenzetti. You enter this room and facing you there's a fresco showing the effects of good government. And the fields are well tilled, the walls of the city are in good repair, maidens are dancing in the streets, a lovely fresco. And then on the opposite wall, you've got the effects of bad government. And you have this horned devil in the middle, marked tyranny. And there's a figure of liberty being lowered into a tomb. The walls of the city are falling apart. Diseased citizens are walking through the city. This is what you don't. The third wall has the answer, which is like a 14th century PowerPoint slide. It's quite extraordinary. And it shows the relationship between sapientia, wisdom or intelligence, justice, the engaged citizens, and floating above the vision of good government, there's a little winged figure, and she's holding up a little banner saying, "Under my wings, all this is possible." And her name is Securitas, or security. So here we have the 14th century, the town people are being told, if you've got security, then you can have good government. Once you move away from that, the risk is you get driven into tyrannical behavior. So it's a wonderful allegory, and I think it applies just as much today. That's why we say the first duty of government is to provide a framework of security.
Yeah, that's great. Question right here.
How do you reconcile misinformation from government agencies with trust? I mean, you mentioned earlier on about the Apple incident and the FBI. It has been known in the last few weeks that the FBI could do a lot more than they pretended that they couldn't do and that they needed Apple to do. So they were underestimating and understating what their capabilities were. Now that doesn't build confidence either in the FBI, and if that happens in the UK, where the agencies are stating one thing, but it's actually not true. So how do you reconcile creating that trust when some of these agencies are actually not saying what they are capable of?
I'd have to add, of course, that Apple maintained publicly that it was quite impossible to get into this phone without building the parallel system, and then the FBI found an Israeli company who magically appeared to be able to get it open. So, there's exaggeration on all sides. The key message is that governments and their agencies have to build trust before the trust is needed. And that is a long-term, day in, day out process. Just look at this country, look at what was said during the Brexit campaign, and you realize that not everything that gets said is true. You can only build, actually trust is a tricky word. I think trustworthiness is a better word. What makes an institution or a person trustworthy? And the answer is consistent behavior of integrity, consistent behavior, delivering what you said you would do. This builds up a sense of trustworthiness, and sensible governments do that. So that's apple pie, but there you go.
Yeah. Well, we're out of time. We could spend the entire day here. People who are interested in the book, it's called Principled Spying. Will you read the code one more time?
Yep.
Available for pre-order.
Yeah. If you go on to www.oup, that's oxforduniversitypress.com, and insert the code caps AAFLYG6. And you'll get 30% off.
Sir David, thank you so much. It's a real privilege and an honor. Thank you for being here. Take care.